Hello there. 2 years after the UK left the European Union, the British economy is suffering from the consequences of Brexit, and even entrepreneurs who voted for it are complaining about problems. There's only cost, 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 no benefit, says, for example, Adrian Henry, managing director of Robinson Brothers. The EU is still an important market for the small chemical company in central England. The problem is not about tariffs, says Hanran, because they have been largely abolished by the free trade agreement between London and Brussels. With the UK leaving the EU, however, came a flood of new rules. We now probably have 25% more administration costs just to deal with the paperwork, complains the entrepreneur. Robinson Brothers exports around 70% of its products, more than half of them to the EU. The company employs 265 people and produces chemicals for various industries such as food, electronics, and pharmaceuticals. Henry is not alone with his problems. According to the British Chamber of Commerce, 56% of British companies are having difficulties adapting to the new rules when trading with the EU. Companies feel like they are hitting a wall because nothing has been done to help them, said the Chamber's Director General Siobhan Haviland. The longer the current problems remain unaddressed, the more EU traders will go elsewhere and the greater the damage. But it cannot be addressed. It's Brexit. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's government says it believes the UK economy has slipped into a recession due to rampant inflation caused by the energy price crisis and the Ukraine war. However, analysts also blame Brexit for the sharp increase in the cost of living on the island. There is strong evidence that the devaluation of sterling immediately after the 2016 Brexit vote led to higher inflation, particularly for imported goods, said Nikhil Detta of the London School of Economics. New trade deals like the one with Australia are tiny compared to the losses in trade with the EU, and I must say, not very beneficial for the British economy. Swati Dhingra from the Bank of England attests that Brexit is responsible for a much stronger slowdown in trade in Great Britain compared to the rest of the world. And Jonathan Ports from King's College London estimates the drop in trade at 10 to 15% compared to a scenario without Brexit. The government advisory body, the OBR, expects UK industrial production to fall by around 4% in the long term. The loss of workers from the EU is also weighing heavily on companies, especially in the health sector, gastronomy, and agriculture. Since Brexit, some staff have been recruited from non-EU countries, but this has not compensated for the lack of staff. In view of the consequences, large business owners who voted for Brexit are also urging the government to relax immigration laws. In terms of immigration, it's definitely not the Brexit I wanted, said Simon Wolfson, CEO of clothing giant Next. Tim Martin, head of the Wetherspoon pub chain, made a similar statement. And for Robinson Brothers, it's about survival. If this continues, we have no choice but to reduce our supply to stay in business, says Managing Director Henren. We had 2 or 3 very large German clients who told us that they would no longer come to us because it was too complicated for them to work with someone in the UK. The proportion of UK smaller companies exporting abroad has fallen following Brexit. One exporter in 8 has stopped selling to the EU temporarily or permanently, and another 10th are considering doing so. That was said by Lucy Monks of the Federation of Small Businesses, which represents small firms and the self-employed. Around a fifth of these companies are currently still exporting their goods or services abroad, according to the association, and this is the lowest level since the beginning of the pandemic, when restrictions caused trade to collapse overall. Great Britain left the European Union at the end of January 2020 and has also not been a member of the EU Customs Union and the EU Internal Market since January 2021. The Brexit trade agreement, agreed at the last moment, ensures freedom from customs duties in most areas. Nevertheless, There are difficulties in trading due to increased bureaucratic requirements. Small companies want to trade and expand into new markets, but they still face hurdles, says Monk. She's the International Relations Officer at the Industry Association, by the way. These included, for example, higher delivery costs and more papers to be filled out. The association hopes for future simplifications through the planned digitization of trade checks. Monks warned that the British government must also take into account the challenges and needs of smaller companies when negotiating further trade agreements. Does she really believe that? Due to Brexit, the contributions of the EU countries to the budget have also shifted, and a lot of money went to two disputed states. But the main part is Germany paid more money into the EU budget in 2021 than ever before. According to calculations by the DPA news agency, the Federal Republic contributed around 25.1 billion euros net to the European Union's joint expenditures in 2021. The bottom line is that France gave only about half as much money with 12.4 billion euros, Italy with around 3.2 billion, that's less than a seventh. The contributions of the individual EU member states are based roughly on their economic strength. According to the calculations, the largest net recipient in absolute terms was Poland, which received around 11.8 billion euros more from the EU budget than it paid in. They were followed by Greece with 4.5 billion euros, Hungary with around 4.1 billion euros, and Romania with just under 4 billion euros. In 2020, the German net contribution was still significantly lower at around 19.4 billion euros. However, during the negotiations on the EU financial framework for the years 2021 to 2027, the Federal Republic and the other net contributors then agreed to increase their contributions again in order to largely compensate for the loss caused by the net contributor Great Britain leaving the EU. The figures are perhaps politically explosive, above all because of the large flow of money to Poland and Hungary. Both states have come under criticism because they are accused of serious violations of the rule of law and other fundamental values of the EU. For this reason, only certain funds from the community budget earmarked for Hungary have been frozen for the time being. The EU Commission, which is responsible for both the EU budget and compliance with the rule of law in the EU, did not want to comment on the figures. The Brussels authority has not published the balance sheets for some time because it fears that the figures could be used politically, for example, by EU opponents in the net contributor countries. But I don't think so. Most people know what we have in the EU. In addition, the Commission points out that the EU budget is very small compared to the national budgets and that the benefits of EU membership cannot be derived from the budget figures alone. For example, it's argued that the financial advantages that export nations like Germany have from the free movements of goods were left out. And that's a very important point because that's also seen like this in Berlin. No other European economy benefits as much from the EU internal market as the German economy, says a website of the federal government. Germany pays a lot of money into the EU pot, but benefits even more from it. How much money an EU state has to pay into the community budget, as I said, depends essentially on its share of the EU's economic power. Calculated per capita, in addition to the Germans, the Danes, Swedes, the Dutch and Austrians are also important net contributors, and Ireland too, by the way. The federal government announced last year that Germany would probably make a record contribution. At that time, however, only a gross amount was mentioned. There are different calculations for how the net contribution is made up. In the balance sheets previously published by the EU Commission, the tariffs levied by the member states on imports into the common internal market and returns for administrative expenses were excluded. According to figures for 2018 that are still available, Germany made a net contribution of around 13.4 billion euros. Calculated differently, the balance for Germany at the time would have been minus 17.2 billion euros. The extra budget Next Generation EU was not included in the calculations for 2021 because it is financed through joint debt. And with that, another miserable year comes to an end today. And of course, we must not forget, especially today, how the people in Ukraine are suffering from Russia's criminal war of aggression. But let's all hope that 2023 finally has a lot of positives to offer. For the people of Ukraine, for the citizens of the UK, and for all of us. Stay optimistic and stick to the facts. Happy New Year. And next year it still will be I'll be back.